They fired me on the Friday before Christmas. I was still holding a glass of someone else's champagne, wrapped in the office lights, and in that same second they told me to pack my things by Monday. "It's for the company," they said to my face, as if I should applaud that verdict. I stepped outside into the city that had no idea my life had been clipped. Storefronts gleamed like nothing had changed. People walked past with blinking paper bags and happy faces. I kept my coat buttoned, hands shoved in pockets, and the plan formed itself like frost on glass, precise, slow, patient. Not a scream. Not a scene. A campaign. The first week was about surviving the quiet. I cleaned my desk, grabbed my laptop, pretended the holiday party had been a sad, forgettable mistake. Behind every tight smile I edited my resume, called an unemployment counselor, and learned how to ask the right questions to an HR rep about severance and documentation. They were careful, they had a lawyer whispering to them. So would I. You don't get revenge by being reckless. You get it by making other people's systems turn against them. I started small, cataloging. Every email, every Slack thread, every handoff where I had saved a project from derailing and never been thanked, I saved. Timestamps, versions, commit logs, design files. I pulled meeting notes and screenshots. Where I had spoken up in a conference call and the VP had used my line in an investor deck, I had the recording. The mundane paper trail people ignore becomes devastating when someone knows how to read it. Then I called an old colleague, Sam, who now ran a small boutique PR firm. He owed me one. I didn't ask him to publish anything. I asked him for advice, how to craft a narrative that investors and reporters would take seriously. He said 2 words I circled: credibility and timing. You plant the seed in the right garden and the weeds do the rest. Timing became everything. I let the holidays pass, let the company breathe, let them assume the story was finished. While they celebrated, I dug. I found the audits showing how the budget for my division had been redirected toward a pet project the executive team loved. A project I'd warned about. I found emails where the CEO asked me to quietly accelerate a marketing number by moving spend. I found a contract clause a vendor had quietly added at the board retreat. Each piece was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern of management decisions that weren't as innocent as the memo claimed. Next, I rebuilt a network I'd neglected. Mentors, former clients, an old investor who respected grit, a university professor who'd once praised my work publicly. I started sending short, factual notes, not rage-filled rants. I'm putting together a documented account of X department's decisions and outcomes from last year. You might find this relevant to your portfolio. I attached one airtight artifact, a dated spreadsheet showing how the company's projections had been manually adjusted after my report. People in positions of influence don't like being surprised. They like to be briefed before things hit the press. I briefed 3, a local business reporter who covers corporate governance, the partner at a venture fund who'd funded one of our clients, and an external ethics advisor who consults for boards. None of them were my enemies, they were readers, partners, and advisors. All 3 responded with interest. Then I let the smallest one act first. The ethics advisor, after a quiet conversation, asked for a formal copy of the documentation. He replied with measured words, "There are inconsistencies here that should be examined. If the board is made aware, they will want clarity quickly." I smiled and quietly forwarded the advisor's note to the board's assistant with a line. "I believe the board will want to review this ahead of next week's meeting." The assistant's reply said, "Received. Scheduling review." Paperwork moves faster than people think. A little official attention forces people to make choices they would otherwise avoid. At the same time, I seeded the narrative where it would matter most. Sam, the PR friend, drafted a careful memo for a respected reporter. Not an exposé, just a questions to the company, piece rooted in documents I provided. The reporter filed nothing impulsive, he asked questions. The company answered with a carefully vetted statement that looked defensive. Defensiveness is a tone reporters love to poke at. Then the grind began for them. The CFO had to explain numbers at a board meeting. The CEO was asked to produce invoices. The board, prompted by the advisor, requested an internal audit of last quarter's allocations. Emails pinged in executive chains. The same executives who'd fired me now had to defend the decisions they'd hidden behind memos and comfort language. That discomfort is a currency you can spend. I never looked for vengeance in the form of violence. I wanted what they cared about the most: credibility and calm growth. So I targeted those. When the internal audit found irregularities, nothing criminal but sloppy and enough to look negligent in the wrong hands, the board paused a project and asked for external review. Investors started asking questions. The company's PR team issued more statements. Each statement was a bandage. Each bandage drew attention to the wound. Meanwhile, I stayed invisible. I took temp gigs, fixed friends' networks, did pro bono consulting for a small nonprofit to keep my head clear. I volunteered to speak at a local startup meetup and casually mentioned lessons learned about transparency and accountability. People listened. Word spread in the industry that someone with the experience I had was available, that I had a track record. Offers came in, not the kind that made a headline but the kind that rebuilt stability. I was knitting a net. 3 months after the termination, a follow-up piece ran in a respected local business outlet. It referenced the advisor's initial note and quoted an outside analyst about governance lapses. The company's stock, thinly traded, took a small dip. That small dip changed the tone. Investors who used to smile at the CEO began asking for regular updates. The CEO returned calls he'd been leaving unanswered. I watched it all with tea on my kitchen counter, feeling neither triumph nor glee, just focused satisfaction. Work done well is its own kind of victory. And yet the story wasn't over. They could still rally. Executives hired consultants and tried to push the narrative into growing pains. They could attempt to rebrand, to blame market shifts, to make me the angry former employee. That was the defensive playbook. I had already anticipated it. I had witnesses, neutral documents, and people who weren't invested in my personal grudge. Credibility is the guardrail that keeps personal vendettas from being written off as bias. Certainty shrank. So I pressed the next button, the one that turned professional discomfort into tangible consequence. I quietly shared a compiled packet, clean, factual, and primarily focused on financial reallocations and poor governance, with a fund partner who'd been considering partnership with them. I prefaced the packet with a single question: would this affect your decision? He didn't answer immediately. He forwarded it. 2 days later I saw the first visible blow, a delayed closing on a partnership that had been weeks away. A week after that, a senior recruiter withdrew a job posting that would have filled a critical exec slot. Suddenly the company that had thought a Friday sack out was a neat little problem found itself gasping for forward motion. The board called an emergency strategy session. The CEO looked tired in the images that leaked out. I didn't celebrate. I continued building. I took the calls from recruiters who wanted someone unflappable, and I avoided speaking ill of my former employer. People respected that. It made my case cleaner. The clean narrative, the one built with documents and calm witnesses, moved quicker than drama. When your enemies need to show they are secure and they can't, your leverage grows. By the time Christmas had been put away for another year, the people who had told me to leave were the ones explaining themselves in the harsh light of audits and investor queries. The company cycled through a PR firm, then another. They reorganized. They did damage control. I watched their certainty shrink. Momentum is an odd thing. It doesn't roar, it accumulates. A missed call here, a withdrawn offer there, a spreadsheet that suddenly can't be defended without sweat. By the time January rolled fully around, the air in the company had changed. People who had once nodded at the CEO's jokes now rehearsed questions before walking into meetings. Confidence leaks slowly like air from a tire, and once it's gone you can feel the vehicle sag. But leaks are reparable. The board could hire consultants, the CEO could reframe the narrative, the PR firm could spin. That's why you don't stop at a leak. You needle the system until the repairs become impossible without admitting a problem. I had 3 levers left: partnerships, internal trust, and a public narrative that the company couldn't simply buy off. The first 2 were already bruised. The third needed polish. I began with partnerships. The fund partner who'd paused was a person of networks. He talked to other partners, other firms. I cultivated those connections quietly: lunches with people who'd been burned by sloppy governance, casual coffee with a legal consultant who had deep ties to compliance officers. I didn't shill, I listened. In those conversations I learned what scared them most: surprises. A surprise in due diligence is a reputational grenade. I was handing them a map that showed where grenades were buried. One rainy Thursday I sent a neutral note to a current partner of the company, a short, factual file, nothing emotional. For your awareness, it said. The partner forwarded it to his legal team, who pinged ours. Suddenly the company had to answer to someone who could pull funding strings at will. That's how leverage multiplies. You introduce a variable third party who cares more about risk than apologies. Next, I focused on internal trust. If executives were no longer confident they could get clean reports from their teams, paranoia would grow. Paranoia is combustible in an environment of deadlines and investor pressure. I didn't fabricate anything. I simply made sure queries were coming from the right places and at the right time. I asked a former colleague to raise a few technical questions at a meetup we both attended. The questions were basic but precise. The room's chatter translated into private messages back to the engineering leads. They replied defensively. Those defensive replies landed on the desk of someone who had been keeping an eye on governance. Then came the public narrative. You don't need sensationalism to win, you need credibility. Sam, the PR guy, suggested a measured op-ed, not about the company but about governance culture in growing startups. I wrote it plainly, lessons learned, concrete examples anonymized, and a call for standard practices. The piece ran in a respected local outlet and it did something more potent than attack. It framed the conversation on terms favorable to me. When the company put out statements about growing pains, readers now compared those words with my op-ed. Context matters. With each small nudge, doors began to close. A potential distribution agreement faced a legal review delay. A software vendor asked for additional audits before continuing integration. The CEO, once untouchable, now forwarded messages with lines like, "We need an answer in 24 hours. Pressure constricts decision-making. Anxious people make mistakes." Around this time, an old friend, Jenna, who worked in procurement for a large retailer, called. She'd heard about the audit. "If their numbers are off," she said, "we freeze. I can't sign contracts if the partner looks risky." I didn't ask for favors. I provided facts and documentation she could trust. She appreciated precision. 2 weeks later, the retailer postponed onboarding their product. A cascade started. But I still hadn't landed the real blow. All these moves were erosion. Erosion will collapse a cliff eventually, but sometimes you need a final fracture. My final move had to be surgical and public enough to matter to humans who measured everything in headlines and quarterly charts. So I turned the story into a simple ledger and offered it to a journalist I trusted. Not sensationalist but rigorous. I handed over documentation highlighting a pattern. Decisions that shifted resources into projects people outside the core team described as pet initiatives. I included emails where funding had been rerouted, notes showing engineering concerns had been downplayed, and the audit findings that pushed the board to pause a major rollout. The journalist didn't need to dramatize, the work spoke for itself. When the article published, it was not a bomb, it was a mirror. Headline: Board questions raised over company spending, growth strategy under review. The tone was curious and professional, but the effect rippled. Partners emailed their legal teams. The incubator that had been a towel to wipe the company's face asked for more transparency. The CEO was photographed leaving a meeting looking older than his age. The company's page of press releases filled with careful language and promises of full cooperation. Those phrases normally soothe stakeholders. This time they signaled a diagnosis. Here's where people make a mistake. They assume you celebrate when the other side stumbles. I didn't. I watched. I measured. The point of this campaign was not spectacle. It was to make the executives feel the slow removal of their safety net. That's when your options multiply. When they are scrambling to plug holes, they pay attention to the people who push the water. My final button was the one that forced an official reckoning. I assembled a clean, professional packet. Audits, email chains, vendor invoices, the advisor's note, and offered it to the board's independent committee and to a partner at the fund with a reputation for integrity. No drama. Just the documents, properly indexed. The partner read, discussed, and then called the board. He asked one simple question in a voice the board couldn't ignore. Are you sure you want to proceed without full disclosure? That question is a lever because it flags liability. The board paused the initiative. The CEO was put on a temporary leave while an external review was commissioned. Investors publicly requested clarifications. The project that had once been trumpeted as a strategic moonshot was put on ice. Not because of a scandal, but because the institution that funds those projects no longer trusted the narrative. Trust is more fragile than cash. I sat in my small kitchen and watched the news ticker on my laptop roll through the updates. There was a strange satisfaction in seeing systems respond to evidence. Not vengeance as heat, but justice as consequence. But even as the company stalled, I knew my work was not done. People who had been part of the decisions needed to understand the cost of choices, not just the immediate embarrassment. Rebuilding their credibility would require time, and the final act I had in mind would force a public, personal consequence they could not paper over. It would be visible, it would hurt where pride lives, and it would ensure that the next time someone reached for an easy layoff they would think twice. The pieces were in place. The board had convened. The partner had paused the partnership. The CEO was vulnerable. Now I had to decide how to shape the finale so it would sting but not destroy, Because destruction is easy and meaningless. Consequence is the lesson. I poured the last of my tea and opened my notebook. The final line on the page was short. Public accountability. Names in the record. The board's pause felt like the moment before a tide breaks. Everything the executives had been building on habit and bravado began to wobble under the weight of scrutiny. I had given them no fire to fight, only light to show what was already there. Light does strange things. It forces people to change position or to reveal what they hoped was hidden. I remember the morning the external review announced itself. The company sent an email to staff with careful language, independent assessment, full cooperation, temporary reassignment of duties. The phrasing was practiced, the sense of panic beneath it wasn't. In the office Slack channels, people posted emoji-less responses. Recruiters who had been warm now went quiet. My inbox rang with polite messages from old colleagues, thin with worry and interest. Some asked if I had everything I needed. I did. The board called a public meeting. It wasn't a press conference. The company still tried to keep it small, but a handful of reporters managed to get confirmations and were already calling the headlines. I watched the live update feed like someone waiting for a jury to read a verdict that, in this case, would be reputational rather than legal. At that meeting, the company announced the suspension of a senior executive. The language again was clinical. Administrative leave pending review. No scandal, the press said. No arrest. But the public effect was immediate. Vendors pulled back, a scheduled demo was cancelled, an upcoming partnership was delayed indefinitely. The CEO, once used to owning the stage, looked suddenly absent from his own story. That was the moment I had been aiming for, not cruelty but consequence. When the firm that underwrote the project publicly requested documentation, investors began to ask for technical deep dives. When legal teams asked for invoices and minutes, that's when people who'd been counting on the momentum realized momentum could be a fragile thing. There was one more move I needed to make. Names in the record. Institutional pauses are good, but human memory loves ambiguity. You say there were issues, and people forget. You put names on paper, the minutes, the memos, the signatures, and the story is anchored. Names are slow bullets. They don't explode, they persist. I contacted the partner who had paused the deal and asked for a meeting. It was a guarded conversation, not about revenge but about transparency. I presented a compact packet, indexed emails, vendor notes, the advisor's comments, and a timeline mapping decisions to outcomes. The partner flipped through the pages with the deliberate calm of someone who has seen a lot. He asked a single question. Are you prepared to present this to the independent committee if requested? I nodded. Within days the independent committee did request it. My documents were entered into the record. The committee convened in a conference room with thick glass and a table that had seen other reputations fold. I wasn't in the room, that was deliberate. I had learned that sometimes being offstage makes the performance more effective. But the committee's minutes mentioned my packet. That's when the phrase documented concerns began to show in emails and filings. People react when they see their names in minutes. A quiet email became louder. An HR check turned into a formal interview. When asked about allocations in a recorded session, the CFO's voice clipped and careful. We followed standard procedure, he said, words that, in a tape, can be examined and contrasted with emails I had provided. Humans are convincing when speaking in office corridors. Recordings are less charitable. The company tried the defensive playbook. Consulting firms, glassy communications, promises of transparency. But each statement was followed by another small leak. An invoice here, a vendor note there. The PR shields worked for a moment, but the legal review kept exposing punctuation marks that didn't line up. The CEO lost runway with investors. The market, fickle as ever, reacted to uncertainty. Then a practical consequence arrived. A major client paused a rollout citing compliance checks. Not a dramatic headline, but the sort of financial whiplash no startup likes. The momentum that funds pride and paychecks stalled. People began to whisper about leadership. Leadership begins to crumble when your team doubts the map. And that's when the personal ripples reached the executives' homes. Board members woke to uncomfortable calls from their own fund partners. Recruiters posted fewer roles tied to the execs. The CEO found invitations rescinded. The social currency that once patted them evaporated. Throughout it all, I did not gloat. There's a particular taste to seeing systems realign. It's not sugar. It's a measured salt that seasons the relief of someone who was thrown away. I had not sought vengeance for spectacle. I had pursued a correction that would, ideally, make the next person think twice before making the same reckless decision. The company restructured. The external review published a summary that was damning in its understatement. Poor oversight here, conflict of priorities there, and lapses in documentation throughout. Not criminal, the report concluded, but negligent enough to warrant leadership changes and governance reforms. The board accepted resignations. The CEO was offered a quiet exit with conditions. The suspended executive did not return. A few months later, a quiet legal settlement followed, not a headline-grabbing payout, but a corporate commitment to a governance overhaul, a transparency initiative and funding to support staff transitions. The company had survived, but it had been forced to rebuild with a different foundation. For me, the consequences were twofold. Professionally, I had rebuilt my reputation. Quiet offers turned into a full-time role at a company that valued the sorts of systems I had championed. They offered stability, an office with less glitter and more process, and a team that respected the work I did. The work was cleaner. The money was honest. I had a sense of steadiness I hadn't had in months. Personally, the ache didn't vanish. The memory of that holiday framed like a guillotine had left a scar. The people who had once cut me loose rarely looked me in the eye anymore. Some reached out with apologies. Some offered explanations that sought to minimize responsibility. The difference between apology and accountability, I learned, is action that continues after the words. There was an unexpected moment, though, that landed heavier than any email. Months after the dust settled, the board's independent counsel sent a short note, a quiet recognition that my materials had accelerated the timeline for governance reform. It didn't say thank you in a way that wiped the hurt, but it acknowledged that the decision to act had not been arbitrary. That acknowledgement mattered more than the headlines. And yet, here is the uncomfortable truth that sits with me. Winning in this way changes you. I had become meticulous, patient, and strategic, all strengths. But I also had to watch how the anger that fueled those strengths could curve inward. In late nights when the office lights were dim and the world quiet, I sometimes caught myself valuing control in ways that echoed the people I'd opposed. That thought was jarring. I had used their language, their tactics, their appreciation for leverage. At what point had I risked becoming them? One evening at my new office, a junior associate asked me, blunt and curious, "How do you keep yourself from becoming the same kind of person who hurt you?" I leaned back and answered honestly, "You don't stop being like them by matching violence. You stop by choosing different values in your power. Use it to fix systems, not people." That became my new metric. Accountability, yes. Public records, yes. But also mentorship, transparency, and a commitment to improve the systems that make people disposable. Months later, I walked past the building where my old company had its name on the glass. The sign was different now. New faces in the lobby, new leadership photos in the elevator. The street buzzed the same. But I noticed something. The vendors greeted me like a man who had earned a place in the town's working fabric. That quiet recognition felt different than retribution. It felt like reclamation. When people asked if I'd gotten even, I would say no. I got what I should have had, I'd reply. A life where my work counts, where accountability isn't optional, and where people who make decisions know there's a record. The story never becomes a simple victory lap. It's messy and human and, for me, ultimately about the rules we accept in our workplaces and our towns. Revenge, in the way I carried it out, was surgical and public. But the lesson that stuck was quieter. Build things so solid that they can't be stolen from you, and make sure the systems that let people disappear are visible to everyone. In the end, the most enduring change wasn't a fired executive or a delayed partnership. It was a set of policies, a board more vigilant, and a town that now spoke a little louder when someone tried to toss a life aside without consequence. That, more than anything else, felt like the right kind of victory.